food situation gradually began to improve. The ration was increased to 500 grams for workers, 400 grams for office workers, 300 grams for children and non-workers. The revolting additives to the bread were used less and less. People now received their rations on time and almost in full. On the 16th of February, meat in the form of frozen beef and mutton was distributed amongst the population for the first time in months. Things were starting to look up. So far in the war, the Red Army's prospects of lifting the Leningrad siege had been limited because the fighting around Moscow had sucked up all available reserves. But by January 1942, the German army was retreating from Moscow. Now, a large-scale operation was possible at Leningrad. Soviet divisions on the Volkhov River prepared to assault the flank and rear of German Army Group North. Swampy, broken ground meant that tanks were of little use. The success of this offensive will be down to the infantry and the artillery. Meanwhile, General Fedyaninski was put in command of the 54th Army, tasked with breaking through to the besieged city. The Germans turned the high railway embankment near the village of Pogostye into a formidable earthwork. Red Army losses were horrendous, their progress minimal. The Second Shock Army, under General Klekov, attacked German positions near the town of Lyuban, to the south of the fortified corridor. But in their haste to raise the siege, the Stavka High Command ordered attacks that were not properly planned and lacked proper artillery support. One divisional commander, General Antufeyev, reported, "After crossing the river and climbing the left bank, our infantry came under intense machine gun and mortar fire. Our artillery couldn't suppress the enemy fire. It couldn't even make a proper ranging and didn't have enough ammunition." The survivors had to return to their starting positions. Red Army units had advanced 30 kilometers through the frozen forests and swamps. It was the same distance again to reach Leningrad. The threat of encirclement hovered over the German troops. The logical decision seemed to be to order a retreat, but Hitler had forbidden any more retreats. Field Marshal von Lieb, commander of Army Group North, asked to be relieved of command. General von Kuchler was now in charge. Von Kuchler concentrated on holding key roads and railways. This approach was the German salvation. Army Group North was able to keep its units resupplied, and reserves could be moved quickly to threatened areas. Meanwhile, the lead units of the Second Shock Army had to be supplied by the only road that ran along a corridor just 5 kilometers wide, between the villages of Zamoshia and Spasskaya Polist. The forward units were short of ammunition, food and fuel. The Soviet offensive was called off in February. Now the men prepared to defend the ground they'd captured. But it wasn't easy digging in the middle of a swamp. And the supply problems meant many soldiers began to suffer from malnutrition. In March, Hitler demanded that von Kuchler encircle the Soviet troops that had dented the German line. The operation was codenamed Wild Beast. A simultaneous assault by 5 German divisions effectively sealed off the Soviet penetration. The Soviet Second Shock Army was virtually cut off from the rest of the army. Just a tiny corridor, 1.5 to 2 kilometers wide, was left open. All that remained was for the Germans to crush the encircled Soviet units. But first, they launched a fresh assault against the Neva patch. By April, 1,000 Soviet soldiers were dug in there. The Germans waited until the River Neva was full of drifting ice, making it impossible for the Soviets to reinforce the bridgehead. Then they unleashed a torrential artillery barrage. The last sign of life seen from across the river was a crude banner bearing the single word, "Help." Meanwhile, the encircled Second Shock Army received a new commander, Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov. By the beginning of May, the Stavka had decided to try to extricate the remnants of this battered force. But the day before the planned withdrawal, the Germans attacked. The Soviets fought desperately to hold the perimeter as units began to withdraw through the tiny corridor back to the front line. But it was slow progress, and 4 days later, the Germans finally cut off the Second Shock Army. A Soviet artillery officer recorded conditions inside the pocket. The entire area was swept by German fire. The dead and wounded lay all around. Some were delirious. Others cried out for water to drink. Some even asked us to shoot them because they couldn't do it themselves. The Germans didn't attack. They kept us trapped like an animal in its lair and bombed and shelled without mercy. The last soldiers to escape slipped out under cover of darkness. By the end of June, 10,000 had got away, but the Germans had 30,000 prisoners. Amongst them was the commander of the Second Shock Army, General Andrei Vlasov. Vlasov agreed to cooperate with his German captors and became a willing tool of Nazi propaganda. He wrote pamphlets entitled "The Appeal of the Russian Liberation Committee to Soldiers and Commanders of the Red Army" and "Why Have I Taken Up the Struggle Against Bolshevism?" In them, he appealed to Red Army soldiers to join a new anti-Bolshevik Russian Liberation Army. Vlasov helped to recruit Russian prisoners of war to fight against Stalin. General Vlasov became so notorious that Russians referred to all Soviets who sided with the Germans as Vlasovtsi. But most had no allegiance to General Vlasov. The so-called Hivis were Soviet prisoners of war who helped the Germans in non-combat roles. And many anti-Bolsheviks and nationalists from the USSR fought in their own Wehrmacht units, known as the Eastern Legions. Most of Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army was captured near Prague in 1945. Its men were sent to the Gulag. Vlasov and other officers were hanged as traitors. The Red Army had failed to break the Leningrad siege in the spring of 1942. Now, the road of life across Lake Ladoga began to melt. On just one day, the 20th of April, about 80 trucks were lost through the thinning ice. The road of life was closed to heavy vehicles. The Russians waited anxiously for the lake to open to shipping. They knew that when it did, ships and ports would come under heavy air and artillery attack. The severe winter meant it wasn't until the 22nd of May that the lake was clear of drifting ice. The first ships made their crossings, evacuating civilians and bringing in supplies. Soviet air defenses proved highly effective. Only 1% of incoming supplies were lost to German air attack. The Germans sent for Italian MAS torpedo boats, which had proved effective in the Mediterranean, and Seabull armed ferries,